So in terms of conflict, why are we going to talk about conflict? Well, you guys, you probably all know about this, don't you? That it's very sort of prevalent in our family law mediation area and in family law in general, family stuff, especially separated families.
I didn't realise there were so many different aspects to power and conflict, like when we read about chocolate, there's so many different
Yeah, well, I think, you know, in terms of mediation, there's sort of theory and then there's practice. And the theory does help with the practice, like it doesn't always solve the problems, but it just makes you more aware of things, I think. And sometimes it does give you some ideas about strategies. It just depends. So I guess I don't have to sell to you why we're talking about conflict, do I? So I'll move along. But also, and probably people that have done, because a lot of you have done social science type stuff, you might have you explored your own sort of responses to conflict and how you cope with that sort of thing? Because that's also something in a mediation. And actually, years ago I did this child-informed mediation training with Jennifer McIntosh, and we were doing some role plays, and I was in this group and I was role playing a party, and I must have been quite difficult. And this poor girl who was our mediator just burst into tears. And she got really stressed, and the reason she got so stressed was she was a person that did like parenting orders program stuff, but she only ever saw mums and dads separately. And then all of a sudden she had me and someone else who were used to doing, like I'd done lots of mediations and lots of family stuff, and I was very, not that I feel super comfortable with it, but I'm very used to high conflict in the room, and she just couldn't, she said, I just cannot deal with that conflict between the two of you, and she was she was going to even leave the whole course, I think. The poor thing.
She's doing a mediation course to be a mediator.
She was, she was actually doing a course that was for people that were mediators and then people that would work with children. So she might have been doing it from the aspect of wanting to work with children. You know, in a child-inclusive mediation process where a social science person might talk to the child separately. So she might have been doing it for that, but anyway. And the people, us role players, sort of had no idea that we probably weren't being, you know, in terms of, say, family law stuff, we weren't being hyper difficult. We were not trying to do too hard, but we weren't obviously being very soft. And that's when you start to think too about your own sort of comfort with conflict, and also in certain sort of work situations too, how you can not become comfortable with it maybe, but you sort of get used to it. And say for me doing legal aid mediations, even though a lot of them are on the telephone now, and I know for you people, a lot of your mediations are on the telephone too, so it's not quite the same, but a lot of them are very high conflict. So you sort of get used to that type of stuff, even though you probably never feel comfortable with it, I don't think. So obviously it's important for us to think about conflict as mediators. We're going to be dealing with conflict, different levels of conflict. And in our day-to-day lives, it obviously affects everything. Yes, sorry?
When you're talking about the mediator's comfortableness with conflict, when you're dealing with family mediation and there's domestic violence and things like that, although you set ground rules, is it very different in face-to-face mediation that you would have a situation where one party becomes violent towards the other party?
I've never had that. I've had a threat.
And then you just stop the mediation if it starts to look like that.
Yeah, if you think that someone's
Getting out of control.
Yeah, if their safety. I have had ones where it becomes verbally abusive to the level that you might separate them.
Okay, yeah.
So, and actually I've had a few of them.
Yeah.
So most people in general, I think Australians are really polite So even people that really don't like each other a lot, if they're in a sort of formal setting with someone, and a lot of these legal aid mediations have lawyers too, so there can be an advantage in that lawyers, if they're good, can control their people.
So you never have to be concerned about, like, safety. If that was the issue, you wouldn't do mediation in the first place.
Sometimes we have been concerned about safety, not very often. But I have certainly had ones where people become verbally abusive to the point where when you've got them in a joint session, whether it be in person or over the telephone, it's just becoming too negative. So you can start warning someone and say, oh, you know, we agreed to these guidelines for behaviour and blah, 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 but then they just can't control themselves. So that's the sort of thing that's probably more common. But a lot of the time, people are quite well behaved. You know, generally, I think often people surprise you, and
Especially when there's a third person there.
yeah. And then maybe in their separate sessions, they might get a bit more, they might be more annoying for us in that they'll go on and on about the other person to the extent that they're continually, you know, just depending on the dynamics. But that one I had the other day, every time we're in the separate session, and actually we only had separate sessions with the people the other day, and it wasn't about physical violence, it was about the man continually harassing this woman by text, by email, originally by phone calls, and he just, even though he had an affair and played up on her and then she left him, he just can't let it go. And he just can't control his behaviour. And so they were in separate rooms because she just didn't want to have to put up with him. And when he was in the separate room, even with his lawyer, who was a very nice lawyer and who was trying his very best with him, he just continually talked negatively about this woman. So yeah, for good or bad, I guess if we want to be mediators, we have to deal with some level of conflict. Sometimes it can be more difficult. Sometimes it can be more challenging than at other times. And when you have lawyers in mediation, sometimes they get into fights.
Yeah.
I've had to a mediation where the client refused to go back into the room because of the other lawyer. And I have to say he was very justified. The other lawyer was continually making negative comments about him, although it sounded like he'd been really difficult in a property settlement and he hadn't made full disclosure. Although it also sounded like he'd had lawyers that weren't very good. He'd got new lawyers that took quite a long time to get their act together. So there was fault with him and then fault with his lawyers, but the lawyer on the other side just continually was digging at him to the extent where I was thinking, oh, I'm going to have to, you know, we will have a break now. And then his lawyer came back after the break and said he won't go back in the room with her. So I guess an advantage of your process here where you don't have lawyers is that it's an even process. You don't have one person with a lawyer and one person with not. Everyone's at sort of a level playing field. And you don't have lawyers behaving badly, which sometimes they do and they get into fights themselves, and it can really be quite problematic. So I guess in terms of, we're saying here, conflict's not always necessarily bad. It can lead to good things. It can mean, for example, in a mediation, sometimes things can come to a head in a way that, you know, you might be able to clear up misunderstandings. You might be able to get people to apologise for things. Sometimes conflict can lead to people having a better relationship in the future. And that's been interesting too in the workplace mediations where people have been in conflict, because for the workplace ones, which isn't relevant to family, but it's about often the employee being acknowledged. You know how often, and it's probably not the case in your workplace, but often people work in places where they just never get told that they've done a good job.
Oh, no, it's
And just a little bit of positive acknowledgement can go a long way And same and actually that actually is relevant to family mediation, because the sorts of things you can seize upon as a mediator in family mediations is if one parent is prepared to say anything positive about another parent. Like they might say, for example, oh, you know, I think it is important for our son to have a relationship with his mum or dad, or oh yeah, his mum did do good things in caring for him when he was together, or you know, just anything that they'll say that's positive, restating that back and really making a big deal of it can really go a long way. So the same thing about, and with the employees, sometimes it's just enough to change the employee's whole mindset if, say, their manager will say something positive about their work. So that's the sort of things you can look for as a mediator. Sometimes your parties will give you stuff to work with that becomes really important. Not always, sometimes they're giving you all this bad stuff to work with and you're thinking, oh God, that's not going very well. If they ever say anything really helpful, grabbing hold of that and really making a big deal of it. So that's when things can lead to positive change. So positive functions of conflict, and I guess in our mediation, we can sometimes use it to problem solve. Sometimes arrangements, say parenting arrangements aren't working that well, and it is an opportunity to make things better. Can be an opportunity to improve communication between people. Sometimes they've had communication issues that have led to misunderstandings. And we see here conflict often involves a struggle for power, which links to when we look at our power module and the different ways that we say power is about the ability of one person to sort of be able to, just like when you're doing your arbitration and you're making your submissions, part of your power is, can you be persuasive? Can you get the arbitrator to give you the decision you want to? That's part of power, getting what you want. If you're very powerful in a mediation, you might be able to get the other party, say if I'm a party and Alexandra is the other party, if I can convince Alexandra to agree to what I want, I'm very powerful, which might not be a good thing. It might be a bad sort of power that I'm coercing you into that. So Bernard Mayer has written a book, and actually I think I put it in the wrong bag, I was going to bring it along. But he's written the book where we've used his book for our information on conflict and on power. And he talks about this perception of conflict because it's also about whether you perceive that you're in conflict with someone else. You might be in conflict with someone else, but you might not even know that you're annoying them so much. Say if you're, for example, my neighbour, every time he goes away, he leaves this music blaring 24/7, which really annoys me. But I've never actually talked to him about it because I always forget about it until he goes away again. So he wouldn't probably even perceive that's a problem. But every time he goes away, there's this music blaring so that they pretend they're away. And it goes all through the night, like it doesn't stop at 9 p.m. or 10 p.m, it goes all through the night.
He broke me into his house.
And he also trims my trees back on his side of the fence, right back to the, what's it called? The trunk.
Ah.
The trunk.
Yeah. But see, he doesn't have
He doesn't have a conflict. So some of and we can think about our clients in this sort of perspective, is that in terms of conflict, we are prone to some biases. For example, we might try and simplify the conflict in our mind. We might, particularly, we might see, and I saw this once at school, you know, if you sort of perceive someone to be a problem you might think they're a problem even when they're not.
Mhm.
Like a kid that plays up in class,
Yeah.
he hasn't played up this time, but the teacher thinks he's done the particular thing that's just happened. And you know, when you're a parent and you're a volunteer in class, you see the teacher snap at this kid and you think, oh, he didn't actually do that, but he's obviously a problem kid, and the teacher is there 5 days a week dealing with these kids. So that sort of perception too. And that can be something really big in the family mediations when people perceive, oh yeah, he's always letting me down, I can never trust him. That thing about trust and being let down, or they'll never honour their agreement, they'll never be on time, they'll never show up at the right time, they'll always cancel, that sort of thing. So that can really inflame conflict. So we say that the escalation of conflict, that's the increase in conflict, can be fueled by long-standing emotional states, beliefs of being wronged, and the need for retaliation. So some of our defensive responses are, I guess, particularly counter-attacking. So becoming very defensive if someone accuses us of something and we might think, this isn't fair. We become very defensive. We try and make excuses for each other. We try and find a very quick solution, or we might just withdraw and think, it's all too hard. I don't want to deal with this person. I just won't engage in the conflict at all. An attribution theory, which is, and I guess that's probably linked with that kid in the class, isn't it? That we're attributing blame to that kid for a particular incident because we see him as the troublemaker.
Kids as well.
With your own kids as well. And also with our clients, sometimes we might sort of project onto, say my father in the mediation the other day they'd had this terrible sort of relationship. He'd been a drug user all the time, he couldn't get off drugs. He had affairs and he wasn't honest and all that sort of thing. As a result, the mother left him because she just couldn't sort of put up with the drugs and the affairs. But he now projects everything negative onto this poor woman. So everything in the mediation, he sort of attributed everything. It's all her fault. It's all her fault that the boy doesn't want to see me. In the family report interview, he sort of played up when the dad came into the room and said, I don't want to see you. He said, well, it's all her fault because she's always telling him bad things about me. She's always putting him down. So he, in terms of attribution for all this conflict, he just blamed everything on the mother, which was a real sort of problem.
Do you get a lot of people in mediation that can't self-reflect? They just don't, they just won't even go there.
Well, I guess that might be sometimes why they're there and they've got all these problems.
That's like why mediation doesn't work with those people.
And actually the mediation worked with these people in that they reached an agreement. I don't think it worked in terms of improving their relationship at all.
It's like that managing conflict rather than.
Yes, managing, not resolving. We got a solution to the parenting arrangements, and we got an agreement because they'd been the people that had been in court for years. They'd both had enough. The mother really seemed fairly reasonable. This is only my own perception. The father sort of had all these issues and was continually going back to court to sort of prolong everything, I think. He just couldn't leave the relationship alone. So we managed the conflict in terms that we got an agreement about the parenting arrangements, but we didn't really resolve all these relationship issues that are probably really quite negatively impacting on their son, I think.
So how many times will legal aid allow that to happen, to keep going back to court with legal aid?
Yeah, it just depends. Like, I don't actually understand why they were even funding that man for that conference. I'm not sure if he always had legal aid for his prior applications, but yeah, generally it's quite hard to get legal aid. And generally too, it has to be sort of quite extreme scenarios, like sometimes you're not getting to see your child at all. Whereas, yeah, I'm not sure why he, yeah. But I guess, so we do say conflict starts from attempting to meet our needs, and we sort of have, when we think of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, your sort of essential needs to stay alive so that we don't die, and then higher order needs such as things that make for a happier life, like our cups of tea and coffee. We don't really need them, but they make us feel better. So our survival needs being essential, identity, and I guess in terms of our family mediations, identity needs are often quite important too. That thing about I want to maintain my role as a parent, as a mum or a dad, being very important to people. Or after separation, my identity as a part of this family has been quite, what would you say, what's the word? That whole feeling of security and being part of the family, and all of a sudden, so for example, your partner's left, your family's broken up, you might not get to see your child every day because you've got to work out some arrangements. It's quite a major type of identity crisis for people that can really be very challenging for them. So in terms of this Bernard Mayer, he's actually got a psychology background and has written quite a lot about mediation and also working with families who are separated. He's broken conflict up, and obviously this is sort of quite artificial, but in his wheel of conflict, he's broken it up into these different categories. And then he has got some different issues around the edge of his conflict wheel, which I haven't been able to replicate here. But one of them is, and I probably can't remember them all, but one is data or information.
Culture.
One is culture.
Power.
Power.
Personality.
Personality. Excellent. So also those ones that are sort of overarching around these different types of conflict. So even though this is quite theoretical, it can sort of help you in a way when you're in mediations to sometimes think about what's going on for people and what might be some of the causes of conflict. So firstly, we're looking at this category of emotion, a cause of conflict from emotions. So obviously, probably comes into most family mediations. People can feel a range of emotions depending on where they're at. And also sometimes can feel quite defensive. And I guess one of the things too is that often in a family mediation, because people have usually lived together, sometimes for a very long time, and sometimes know each other very well, so they may know exactly how to upset the other person, or how to make them angry, or how to make them frustrated, all that sort of thing. On the other hand, you can have people in family mediations who've had a one-night stand, for example, and they don't really know each other very well. And unfortunately, they've now got a child together, and they've got nothing much in common in terms of their values or anything. So you can get different ends of the spectrum. So as a mediator, how do we deal with these emotions? And actually this is when people were saying when you did your arbitration mediation, well, the mediation is harder to manage.
This is emotion.
Yeah, a lot of that is because of emotions, isn't it?
And they can upregulate within a second.
Yes.
You know, people can be really calm for quite some time and then bang, it could appear out of nowhere.
And I have had people walking out of mediations too.
Mm-hmm.
Say, you know, they all of a sudden something might just push that button and they're out. I have had a mediation that went for many hours, say probably 4 or 5 hours, and then at the very end the person stormed out. I can't remember why. So emotions can escalate to the extent that, say, when you're all together, either on the telephone or in the same room, that it becomes too negative and you have to separate them. Could be to the extent that you don't think it should continue. Could be to the extent that one person just walks out and leaves the mediation. So I guess we don't want to ignore the emotions, we obviously can't. We need to spend a bit of time letting people vent some of that, but we need to sort of be careful about to what extent. We've also usually got a time frame. We use our communication skills, which probably you people have got a lot of already, and which we'll be going through in the course. For example, to listen to, show people that we're listening to them, show by reflecting that we're listening to them, sometimes maybe reframe statements into something more neutral or more constructive or more future focused. Use of having meetings all together, use of having meetings far apart. And there is sort of a fine line with emotions in between letting people vent enough but not too much. And I think that's just really learned by experience, and also you may never get it totally right too. There might be mediations where you think, oh, I should have stopped that before that happened and before they said that, and or should have put them in a separate room earlier, like say with that party that I said got really upset with the lawyer, and he said, I'm not going back into the same room with that lawyer. I thought, oh, I should have separated the parties and their lawyers earlier, because it did get a bit, the lawyer did start continually getting stuck into him, and I think I let that go on a bit too long. So, and probably one of the most difficult things to deal with in a mediation, and for people like the girl in that child inclusive training, if she's used to only dealing with a person at a time, can be quite challenging to all of a sudden have two people interacting and managing. You're shaking your head, are you?
Oh no, sorry, she was just asking if I was alright. No. Sorry.
Oh, you got a bit of a cold.
Yeah, sorry.
No, you're right. I was thinking you were thinking, oh no, I don't want to do that. The other type of conflicts that we're going on to is the communication conflict. Some of our people in family mediation haven't been communicating at all. They're people that don't talk to each other, they can't. And if they've got, say, family violence orders, they might not be allowed to communicate with each other. That can sometimes lead to misunderstandings and miscommunications. And for example, if someone's running late for a pickup and they feel that they can't text the other person because of their domestic violence order, and then the other person gets angry with them, then it can just be sort of a bit of a spiral then of miscommunication and misunderstandings. So sometimes too, particularly with the texts and emails, even though they can be a good way for people to communicate when they're in high conflict, they can also be misinterpreted. You know, people interpret, and we do that at work sometimes, or with people we know. You'll sort of get an email and you'll think, oh gee, that was really rude, but they didn't really intend to be rude. So even though I think text and email have become quite useful for these sorts of people that have troubles, they can also be a bit problematic. And then our cognitive biases come into, particularly when people have been in very high conflict and they're not trusting of that person. They're expecting them to do the wrong thing. They will sometimes perceive things that aren't really there. So I guess this is where having people in the same room in a mediation or on the same telephone link up can be helpful, although obviously it's not always possible because it's not always appropriate. But in the mediations with lawyers, they do tend to like to separate people, and a lot of the lawyers like to do shuttle mediations. So they want people to be in separate rooms, and they feel quite uncomfortable. This is not everyone, but some people. And as a mediator, then you're continually going back and forth between people. In that process, you sort of lose a lot of what may be the benefit of mediation in people getting to hear the other person, particularly when they haven't been communicating at all. Yes?
When you say lawyers are involved in the mediation, but everything within the mediation can't be used in court, how does that work? Because if they're together and one party says something that the other person's lawyer feels they could use that in court,
Yeah, well, I guess that's true of any mediation, whether you've got a lawyer there or not. What is said is heard, isn't it?
yeah.
So say if you're in a property mediation and someone says, oh, I've got money stashed in the Cayman Islands, you've heard that and you can
Yeah.
use that information to subpoena the information. So we will talk more about confidentiality and admissibility in the intake module. So there are rules about that. Generally things are confidential, but what is said is what is heard. Like for example, if you don't know someone's got a new partner, but in the mediation they say, oh, you know, I've got this new boyfriend, they've heard it. So it can also, you know, in a negative way, it can be used. Say if lawyers are there, they sometimes try and practically cross-examine people
Yeah, that's what I'm.
in a mediation, which isn't appropriate.
So it's more that it's confidential from that the mediator will not discuss it, but either parties could.
Well, it's also, when you say it's generally confidential, that means that, say if you go off to court, you can't, when you put your statement into court, your affidavit, say, in the mediation, blah blah said this. So you can't be that overt, but if they said it, you can act on it type thing. You know, if it gives you information about financial stuff, if it gives you information about things you should follow up. Some of the things that you hear in legal aid mediations are sometimes, or someone's been charged with drink driving, or they lost their license because they were, you know, stuff like that, which is what one person hasn't heard before and now they find out at the mediation, which if they did go to court for a parenting matter might be stuff that they could use. So there's nothing you can do about that. It's just that you can't specifically bring it up in court as from the mediation, unless it falls within some exceptions. Okay. And actually, sometimes too, some of the conflict, and you know, around that circle, Maya had data or information. That's sometimes a cause of conflict in that, say for example, people won't have enough information or they'll have conflicting information. So, what's an example of that? And I guess I've got, say in a property mediation, people might have different ideas of what the value of their former matrimonial home was. Well, the way that that could be resolved is they both agree to get an independent valuer and they bring it to the mediation. So that's an example of a data or information conflict which could be resolved. Now, values can sometimes be more difficult to resolve. So the types of things that come up in family mediation, and you might have some ideas too of the things you deal with. Values about discipline, values about healthy food, junk food. I've had a mediation about immunisation, whether a child should be immunised. That then turned into also an issue about whether the child should be homeschooled, because the mother then said, because I stupidly said in a private meeting, oh, what about when your child goes to school? Do you think they may need to be immunised at that stage? Just sort of asking questions. And she said, I don't want to go to school, I wanted to be homeschooled, so that then became another issue for the mediation. Values about religion, particularly probably these days, sometimes it's about one person being religious and one person not, or different religions, different cultures. Anyone had any other ones?
Gender roles.
Mm-hmm. So in what way?
Like what the sex of the child, what they should and shouldn't be doing.
Yes.
Or what's expected of the mother or the father. Like if the father expects the mother to take care of the children, she wants to work, or
Yes, so sort of expectations about what they should be doing because of their gender.
What if they break up and one decides that he's gay, or the woman
Yes.
decides that she's, a lesbian or whatever? That'd be interesting.
So sexuality type things. Other things that have come up for me about schooling, what school people should attend. I had a mediation recently where they both wanted children to go to a private school, but one wanted them to go to the school her brothers had gone to, and the other one, the father wanted him to go to the school he'd gone to, something like that. Something about schools. They both actually had quite a lot in common in that they wanted a private
Yeah.
Catholic school.
It's a good
But
start.
then they didn't agree on which particular Catholic school.
well, that can be about identity too, couldn't it? A lot of private school people are like, what private school did you go to? There's that private school, or exactly the same as us. Or,
Yeah, well, actually, underlying it was just remembering that the mother, because she'd moved to the new partner's side of town, and the new partner's son had a boy at this particular Catholic school, it was going to be easier for her son to go to that school because he'd have the older stepbrother at the school, which sort of makes sense, that you've got an older child to go with him and everything. But the father then was just so upset that she would choose the new partner's son's school over his old school. So that type of thing. Yeah, anyone else got other value ones that you've come up with? Some of the very extreme ones the courts have had to deal with are, if someone say, this is sometimes parents against the hospital, if they've got a particular religion and they won't have a blood transfusion, or they don't want chemotherapy, that type of thing. There's been some of those issues recently where the hospital's taken the parents to court.
Really?
So that's a very extreme sort of value dispute, isn't it? Where that's potentially going to mean that your child's going to die because you object to the treatment that the hospital wants to give them.
Does that go to family court?
Yes.
can I ask, what, and this is, may not be able to be answered easily, if not I'll ask you later on, but if there's like, because I know that we mediate if one person's in Australia, is it? Or well, like for example, it's cross-cultural and they're really different cultures, and in Australia, something may be illegal and in another culture might not, like, I don't know, female mutilation or something like that. What would happen there? Like, because if they're in another country, I suppose the children are okay. Or even things around circumcision and stuff like that, that would be big. They have different views, or
Yeah, well, that would be quite hard to mediate, wouldn't it?
But do we really need to know that kind of stuff? I mean,
but some, one
legal,
parent might
isn't
want
it?
to, one parent might not want to, and they could
Well, they need to come up.
go to
Yeah.
court.
That
Yeah,
is
so I
something.
mean,
That is something too you could go to court about, because
Yeah.
family court has jurisdiction over what are called special medical procedures. So So, you know, those things you just talked about, and I guess probably, I've got a mental block about what's circumcision. The circumcision thing is still more sort of culturally accepted to some extent in our culture, although it's sort of gone a bit out of fashion, whereas the female circumcision in Australian culture isn't acceptable, and I would think it's too illegal.
Could you do like, but if it's arranged marriages and things like that?
Yes.
And the child's in another country, can you mediate around that or not? If one parent lives here and one parent lives
You can really mediate anything.
Doesn't it depend where the child is as far as the legal aspects of it?
The legal
too?
What's legal in the country the child
Mm.
lives
Yeah.
in. Yeah.
It probably, for a mediation, it doesn't matter whether it's legal or illegal, or
You can
what
leave-
country you do it in, if you're by some sort of technology link-up. But I guess if you're a mediator too, you might have ethical issues with mediating about certain practices that you think, for example, are against people's human rights, or that would be my initial reaction.
Yeah.
You can really mediate anything. It doesn't have to be legal or illegal, but would you feel comfortable with that?
And how much input can you have into an issue such as that? If you don't know that culture, or you don't have knowledge of that practice or anything, how
Mm.
much input as a mediator can you really have into that?
But the
that
mediator
discussion?
doesn't make any of the new duties.
Well, in a facilitated mediation, you technically don't have input into what people decide.
Mm.
Also, if people are from a particular culture and it's sort of in the realm of that culture, they might want someone from their particular culture.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But then it might be different if one person's from the culture and the other person's outside of the culture, and they've got that sort of clash.
Mm.
So you can really consider mediating anything, but it would be a matter of the intake and whether it's worth a process too of people who've got very different views. Would they ever get, you know, say for a female circumcision type thing, would they ever get an agreement about that? Would that be something that's realistic to mediate, or is that something?
That's right. Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
But probably issues that are coming up more now that we've got, you know, growing sort of multicultural society, all those issues are coming up for people.
Mm.
So how to deal with values, I guess we've talked a bit about this. Sometimes values are really hard. Sometimes you can talk about what happens in one household doesn't necessarily have to happen in another household, what should and what shouldn't.
And
That
often
type
they
of
live
thing.
with those values when they were together as well.
Yeah.
How do they manage that? Sometimes just need to check.
One parent might want to take children to church, the other
Yeah.
parent might not, and that might be quite fine. That when they've got the kids, same on another level with sport. Some people do. Child goes to sport with one parent but not with the other parent.
Sometimes those value ones in the relationship, they still haven't agreed with it, but they've gone along with it and accommodated it. And once there's a separation, then they feel they've got some more. Yeah, I know. I think that's it.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. We all just love each other.
Also in family mediations, you can normally always get some values in common. Like one thing you can do sometimes, and it can work well and it can not work well, is at the very beginning of the mediation you can say something like, oh, you know, when your son turns 18 and he looks back on his life, what are the key things that you want him to remember about his childhood? And that's worked really well for me in a mediation where we put all this stuff up and it was
I
all,
love that.
you know, they sort of could feel that they had all this stuff in common. And then in another one, and I'm just trying to remember why it worked really badly, because it just became a focus of difference for some reason all the time. But that can be a sort of starting point where you try and get people to, instead of all this argy-bargy about, you know, they've got like a little 2-year-old kid, you can start saying to them, particularly when there's all this conflict and there's all this stuff going on, and they've still got 16 years hopefully before their kid's 18 and just rolls their eyes and says, you know.
See you later.
Well, probably 13 now when it's pretty uncool to be seen with mum at the shopping centre and all that sort of stuff. So that can work well. And even if you don't do something formal like that, like starting the mediation, well, let's think about what your goals are. You can do things like just what they always have in common. Normally they have in common that they think it's important for the child to have a relationship with both of them. Not always, but most of the time. So, you know, just those things where you nearly always get a good response if you ask someone a question. And that's what your intake's for too, to sort of set that stuff up.
So would you leave them with that question at the intake? You know, how do you want your kids to look back at their
Yes.
childhood, and at the end of the intake it's can you consider this in the meantime?
Yeah, you could certainly do that too, because then you could sort of work out how much they've got in common about that. Because often people will say similar things. They'll say things like, oh, I want him to have been happy, I want him to have enjoyed his time. Some people will say things like, you know, I don't want him to have had too much conflict. They will start talking about that sort of stuff.
Do you explore what they think is important to their kids? Like I know when I used to do intakes as a children's counsellor, sometimes that was really hard for parents to know what was important for your child. You know, what do you think is important to your child?
Yeah, well, that's probably a good question too. What's important for your children?
Yeah, what are they interested in? What's your child likes? I guess it gets them thinking, and that can be that school stuff or the music stuff or whatever's important to them as the focus. Yeah.
Because actually for the people I saw earlier in the week that had all these things, all this difference, that was the thing that they had in common, that they had started, now that their son was 6, so he's a little bit older and he's starting to assert himself more in terms of what he wants to do. Because before they argued about should he play AFL or should he do this, or the father likes AFL, the mother doesn't. Now he's 6, he's just starting to say, well, I like AFL. And it's becoming a bit easier. I want to do it. And they were saying, and the father that did sort of had all these issues would go, well, I just want to do what the little man wants to do, you know, like as long as the little man's happy. So he had sort of come to this stage where he'd started to think more about his son and what he liked to do. So that's the sort of area they then have in common, what the little man wants. History, another source of angst for our people, particularly where they've had long-standing conflict. And that thing that always seems to come up in the family ones is the trust, which can be a really hard one. About we don't trust him, her, usually they don't trust each other. It's often not a one-way thing. Sometimes it's a one-way thing, but it's usually a two-way thing, isn't it? And also about things about being let down, or about it hasn't worked well in the past. Nothing's worked in the past. Arrangements haven't worked well. We haven't been able to get along. We always argue. So trying to give them some time to talk about that, maybe try and work out, if we can, why, but then trying to draw a line in the sand and move forward. So I guess spending some time talking about the past. Sometimes even if there's been a particular nasty incident, you might even talk about the nasty incident, because they might need to talk about it to move on. I guess that's a judgment call sometimes. And then that idea of trying to motivate people to change what's been happening, which is probably one of the hardest things. Probably for mediation to work well, people have to be quite motivated to be able to change future behaviour if they've had problems in the past. And that's one of the things with, there are different types of mediation. We talk about transformative mediation, we talk about facilitative mediation. And the mediation model we'll be teaching, I guess, we would ideally like to transform behaviour, but we may not be able to achieve that because that's more a transformative process. And sometimes I would think it would take quite a lot of time to be able to change future behaviour. And that's why we talk about, you were saying, weren't you, about conflict management, not conflict resolution. Will we get to all the underlying causes of the conflict? That really depends on the amount of time, the process, and also the party's motivation. Structural conflict can come maybe in these sort of settings, sometimes from, for example, one person having a legal representative and one person not, or one person having the finances to go off to court if they want to, and the other person not. Can also be about structure in terms of where people live. People have separated and one of them's moved 6 or 8 hours away. That creates all sorts of structural issues, particularly when children are very young. So we can have structural conflict in terms of unequal imbalances or geographic. In terms of people, sometimes in a mediation people will say, oh well, you know, it doesn't matter, I can just go to court. But I guess then reality testing with them, or what's going to happen if you go to court, how are you going to do that, how long is it going to take, how much is it going to cost? Because for anyone who has worked in the court system, I guess has a whole lot of knowledge about the downfalls of the court system.
So we were talking about the other day, I was trying to speak to Joe, is there like any averages, you know, any data on the Family Law Court website of usually the average time and the average cost, and you know, like, so people can really look at data and be like, whoa, that is really expensive, I didn't think of it
I don't
until
know
they
if,
get to that stage.
Put it on that website, Happy Family Lawyers website. What's her name?
Larissa.
She's probably got it on access. Happy Family Lawyers. I've got it somewhere. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, because if they're at mediation and you don't have, the mediator doesn't have a legal background, you know, they can't advise them anyway, but to have that information before they go into like a mediation,
You can say
might
it can
make them
take up
take
to
it more
2
seriously.
You can say that. You can say, look, on average it can take anywhere from 2 to 3 years, maybe more, for a court case to be finalised. You can say, that, you know.
I don't think it's possible really to have an average amount of cost either, because it really depends on
how many
Lawyers'
days
fees and stuff
they
like that. Yeah. But that wouldn't be giving legal advice?
No, that's not, it's not legal advice to give out information.
It's just general.
So information is things like, no, it can be very expensive to go to court, it can take a very long time, it can take, for example, 2 years to get a final hearing. That sort of thing isn't,
Might not know that.
Yeah,
and they go,
but we tell them that.
Amount of
I give them the worst case as well. The guy I spoke to the other day, it was $200,000 in 4 years.
the other thing you can say too is, and this is information, is the research shows that going to court can really escalate conflict. and particularly be damaging for children. So that's really just information. So that's the sort of things people have to think about.
Do you have many clients that come into mediation that don't really understand the court system? They don't think it's gonna be tens of
I don't think anyone
thousands of
understands the
dollars.
court system.
Not call you, I'll say.
I think most people don't understand it unless they go to it.
What advice? I want to know if they want to go
Yeah,
straight
yeah.
to court and get a decision now.
Mm.
Okay.
And actually that's
Okay, well, they're probably going to be around 17, 18 by the time you get a decision.
Yeah, well,
Well,
I think most people don't have a good idea of what the court system's like unless they've been in it or they've worked in it. And I think it's quite okay for mediators just to give general information.
Yes.
It's probably not possible to have an average amount of what it would cost. But I know lawyers. The other day I was at the court doing this pro bono project thingy, and they were saying just for a domestic violence hearing it was $10,000 minimum for domestic violence. And I don't even know if that was for a hearing actually. So lawyers' costs are very expensive. I guess people might think, oh well, I'll do my case myself, but that's quite difficult. On the other hand, I guess some people don't have the option of not going to court because their other party is quite unreasonable. So mediation, on the other hand, doesn't work for everyone, unfortunately. Mm. And one of the negatives. Sorry.
Well, sometimes the one with the power would keep escalating and pushing and going back to court, going back. They got the money, they got the power.
Yes.
And if they've got the kids, then just be
Mm. And that's sort of the worst case scenario for people, I think, is when you've got another party that the other party is quite difficult. So that's mm. Yes. And I guess the positive things about there's now compulsory mediation for parenting cases. So the positives of that is it does really encourage more people in general to try and make decisions themselves for their children. But some of the negative aspects are that some people just see that as a hurdle. So they just say, oh, I just want to get my certificate. And they either come to a mediator and they want something like a non-appropriate certificate, like the case isn't appropriate, or they want to come to a mediation but they don't really want to genuinely participate. So that's some of the downsides of the compulsory nature of mediation. Or they use it in a strategic way and they come to a mediation sort of pretending that they're going to participate, but at the end of the day, after many, many hours, you realise that they never intended to settle. So it can be used in a negative way, and there's probably nothing much we can do about that. We can try and suss that out at intake, and sometimes we don't sniff them out. But I think generally it's certainly led to more people. There's a lot more people today than say 10 years ago that are mediating, that are making their own agreements. In some ways there's been lots of positive changes, but then on the other hand there's been negative changes in this sort of perception of rights to time. That's probably the most problematic change, and people really insisting on their rights to time, and in my time I want to do what I want to do, that type of thing. So, just see, what I wanted to do next was an activity. So in terms of the conflict, we've just had a look at some of the causes of conflict. So in terms of conflict, it's going way, way back to here. So So I've just got a scenario here that I want you to work on. Maybe and say, do you just want to do it with the person next to you? So I want you to read the scenario, and then we're going to, the question is, what types of conflict are present and what strategies and interventions as a mediator would you use to attempt to resolve the conflict? So we want types of conflict and then the sorts of strategies you might use.